Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade. He spent 25 years in service to our country and is a veteran of the Iraq War, where he suffered very serious injuries, including the loss of his right leg. He stayed in the Army until his retirement in 2017. Colonel Gade is a recipient of the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. He ran for the U.S. Senate in Virginia in 2020 and is now co-author of a new book examining the problems and possible fixes for the disability system at the VA. The book is entitled Wounding Warriors: How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. And Colonel Gade, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Well, let's start with your story. Where were you born and raised?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Minot, North Dakota. My father had moved to North Dakota after the Vietnam War. He was a Vietnam War infantryman and had moved to North Dakota and promised my mom that he would only stay there they would only stay there like 2 years. And 40-some years later, he died there, and my mom still owns a house there. So I was born and raised in Minot, North Dakota.
Fantastic. And as you said, he's a veteran himself, correct?
That's right. That's right.
You attended West Point. When did you realize you wanted to go there and become an officer?
Well, so my middle name is MacArthur because my mom is a total patriot and named me after General Douglas MacArthur. And so, of course, he was a West Point grad. and so from an early age, I knew I was going to serve. And then I knew I wanted to be an officer. And so West Point seemed to be the logical way to do that. But I enlisted in the Army first. I enlisted in 1992, and then I went to West Point in 1993.
How did West Point change you?
It's great. I mean, I really think that West Point they try to take good raw material and form it into something, more useful than it was before. So, and actually that's a theme of Wounding Warriors, is that our system takes productive plows out of society, changes them into swords, and then what do we do with them after their service? And so I'm sure we're going to talk about that more.
Yeah, definitely. You had about 4 years in the service between commissioning at West Point and the terrorist attacks on 9/11. What were some of your assignments during those couple of years before 9/11?
So I was in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. After all my officer training and stuff, I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and I was in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment as a tank platoon leader and a scout platoon leader. And then I was a general's aide. And then in 2000 or 1999, 2000, I think, I went to the Marine Amphibious Warfare School at Quantico, Virginia, as an exchange student with the Marines when I was a brand new captain. And then on September 11th, I was actually at Ranger School as a captain, and we thought it was part of the road to war. We thought it was part of the scenario. So like every Army school, of course, has like a scenario built around all the training exercises, or as the impetus for all the training exercises. And so when we heard on people's radios and stuff that there'd been some terrorist attack, we thought, oh, okay, so that's the scenario, and now we're going to go in the woods and kill terrorists as Ranger School students, But then quickly it became apparent that this was real. But what's interesting is I didn't see any of the video. Everybody else who's alive watched all the video from that day, and you watched the towers come down again and again and again all day long. I didn't see any of that until November. And so everybody else has this shared cultural experience, but those of us who were in Ranger School, and I suppose probably a few other kind of high-stress schools around the military, have nothing. I've got nothing. So the first time I ever saw the towers come down was November, and I'm like, So I went into Ranger School in a world at peace, and I came out in a world at war.
What did that mean for your next assignments and deployments?
Well, for me personally, sometimes I say that I lost my leg on 9/11, in a sense, right? Because that set in motion all of the things that would eventually happen. But for me, my assignment was to go. I was supposed to go to Korea, and so I ended up going to Korea. I got to Korea in December of 2001, and I had this assignment there, and so it was like, oh, rats! I guess I missed the war, so I missed the war in Afghanistan, and then when the Iraq War kicked off in March of 2003, I was commanding a tank company in Korea, waiting for the North Koreans to come pouring across the border, and obviously that never happened, thank God. But again, I thought I had missed the war, and then in spring of 2004, my boss and his boss came to me and said, "Hey, Daniel, we're sending your soldiers to Iraq." I had orders to leave already to go to grad school. And they said, hey, we're sending your soldiers to Iraq. Your choice. Do you want to go with them or do you want to go to grad school? And I was like, here, my Lord, send me. Obviously, I want to go with my soldiers to war. And so we did. We got to Kuwait in August of '04.
And what was your assignment? What was your unit? What part of Iraq did you head to?
Yeah, so I was part of Second Infantry Division, and I was a tank company commander. So I had 3 tank platoons, about 100 guys, if you count mechanics and medics and all the enabling folks. I had about 100 guys, and so we landed in Kuwait on August 7th, and we spent 2.5, 3 weeks in Kuwait. And then we went into Iraq at the end of August by convoy, and we went all the way to Ramadi. So we went through Baghdad, and then we went to Anbar province to Ramadi. And at the time, and it's so funny that this is such like old history for most people, but at the time, Ramadi was kind of the center of the insurgency. There was Fallujah and Ramadi, 2 ends of a balloon, and if you squeeze one, the other one gets bigger, Mm-hmm. And so Fallujah and Ramadi were the center of the insurgency. But Ramadi was the capital of Anbar province, and so that's where we got sent, and it was by far the most violent place in Iraq at the time. I mean, it was an absolute disaster area. So I only spent 5 months in combat, and I know you have guys all the time who are like, oh, I did 13 deployments or whatever, and I spent half of one deployment, right? And but I was wounded twice by enemy fire in 5 months as a company commander.
2004, Anbar province, like you said. I mean, that's
pretty sketchy.
Yeah, we've talked to Marines who fought in Fallujah. I mean, the danger there is immense. So, 2 different situations where you were injured. Walk us through both of those. If you can.
Totally. So, November 10th, '04, I was assigned to, as part of a much larger operation. My unit was on the eastern edge of Ramadi, in kind of a blocking position all day long, and we'd had sporadic small arms fire and RPGs and stuff like that fired at us, and we'd fired some and things like that. So we'd been in like small levels of contact all day, but by the end of the day, you're out with tanks, and tanks are pretty thirsty, and you got to keep the engines running and stuff like that. So we were coming back across the main part of town to go back to where our fuel tankers were to get gas for our tanks, and we saw off to the left there was all this gunfire off to the left, and I remember we stopped the tanks and we're looking over there, and I remember saying, wow, somebody's in a serious gunfight over there. And then it dawned on me that like we were in the gunfight because this was all fire coming at us. It just wasn't obvious immediately, and in the dark it's hard to tell exactly who people are shooting at and stuff until tracers are coming at you. And so there was some enemy positions where they were firing at us, and we engaged and destroyed some enemy insurgents who were hiding behind the walls and stuff, and one guy out in the open, and we killed him. And then my tank was getting ready to move out, and we just started to drive, and a rocket-propelled grenade came off the roof of this mosque. And I remember because I saw it in flight. And like in the movies, in the movies they're like slow and sort of, in real life they're fast. And I remember I saw it in flight, and and it looked like a black circle with sparks all around it, and it was coming straight at me. And I was in a position in the tank where the hatch of the tank was over, and there was about this much space where I could see, but I saw it and I ducked, and as I ducked I said RPG. And my soldier next to me, this close on my left-hand side, at arm's length on my left-hand side, was named Dennis Miller. And Dennis was up in the hatch of the tank, about to fire at the enemy with a M240 machine gun that's mounted right there. And then the RPG hit us. And there's all this dust in the tank. There was, people are screaming. There's all this stuff going on. And I said crew report, which is what you say. And the driver said, driver's up, which means I'm okay. Gunner said, gunner's up. And then I looked over, and I was okay. I was wounded. I was wounded in my arm and face, and I was bleeding, but I was okay. I said, I'm wounded, but I'm okay. And I looked over at Dennis, and he was sitting on the floor of the tank. And it's dark. The tank is full of smoke and halon from the fire suppressant and everything. And I reached over, and his helmet was off, and I grabbed his head and I shook him. I was going to shake him to, are you okay, kind of stuff. And my hand went into where his brain was, and because he had been hit in the face by this RPG, it had basically taken off, sort of this quadrant of his head had been destroyed. And so when I brought it back, there were brains on my hand. And I shook his brains off my hand, and I said to my crew, I said, okay, guys, he's dead. Let's go. And they're like, sir, you got to do something, treat him. And in a situation like that, you have to be very calm, I said, guys, he's dead. Let's go. And that gave the crew the sort of impetus to keep going. And I remember as we're driving back, he was married. He was 21. He was married to a 19-year-old named Kimberly. And I remember the way his hands were, I could see in the light of the tank, I could see his wedding ring. And I remember looking at his wedding ring, and I knew he was dead. The next day was Veterans Day, by the way. This was November 10th, 2004. The next day was Veterans Day, and I remember seeing his ring in the light of the tank, and I knew he was dead, but his wife didn't know, and his parents didn't know. And I remember thinking about them, like, So we got back to the base camp, and I jumped out of the tank and walked under my own power into the aid station and got the shrapnel picked out and stuff. But I was returned to duty. It was fine. And they took Dennis's body out of the tank and flew him out. I didn't see him again, actually. We didn't get to do a ramp ceremony or anything like that. I didn't see him again, but they took him out to take him back home to his family.
How soon or how long after that was your second?
Yeah, 2 months. 2 months. So the next day we went back to work, right? We had a job to do, and I was the company commander, so I have to be doing the job. And so the next day we went back to work and we were doing stuff. And, we had lots of enemy contact at the time, small arms, IEDs constantly, I was personally within 50 yards probably of, I don't know, dozens of IEDs probably. And anyway, so on January 10th, 2005, we were out doing a presence patrol kind of thing, meeting with some tribal leaders, some sheikhs, and looking at schools and trash like that. And I remember we were on this canal road, and I remember I had my rifle between my knees, and I remember looking out of an up armored Humvee, and I was looking out, and I remember thinking, this is a really sketch place. This is a scary place, because it was daylight. It was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon or something like that. And then I woke up on my back in the ditch, and my soldiers are trying to I was on a stretcher already, and I heard somebody screaming, and I tried to go to them, because you try to render aid, and my soldiers pushed me down. And they're like, "Sir, you're the only one. Relax." And I was like, "I'm the only one. What?" And then I was like, "Oh no, I'm wounded again, And so I lifted my head up, and I could see my soldiers working on my legs. But I could see my body armor was all blown up, and I could see what I thought were my guts. Like, it was a mess. And my battalion executive officer was holding my hand and talking to me, trying to keep me out of shock and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, like, oh gosh, my legs are blown open. I can see my guts. There are some vital structures in that vicinity that I need to check on. So I said to Major Cotton, who retired as a colonel a couple of years ago, I said to Major Cotton, I said, "Hey, sir, I got to ask you something." He's like, "Yeah, anything." And I go, "Are my balls okay?" And he goes, "I don't know, let me check." And so he goes down to where my pants are blown open, and he checks, and he comes back and he said, "Yeah, dude, they're dusty, but they look good to me." But what the cool thing about that story actually is that after I was wounded, when all the pieces were in place for me to get off the battlefield quickly. So there was a helicopter in flight nearby, and at the time the Marines really wouldn't fly day medevac, but there was a medevac helicopter close by that they were able to divert and pick me up. They took me by Marine helicopter to a Navy surgical facility, and when I got there, my blood pressure was 60/0 because I bled out completely, and they gave me all the A-positive blood they had stored, and it wasn't enough. So they went to the mess hall. And they said, "Hey, if you have A-positive, we need your help right now." It was dinner time. And 25 sailors and Marines got up and ran, I guess, to the surgical tent and donated their blood straight into bags and straight to the IV pole into my body, untested, right? Still warm from the donor, untested, and they saved my life. And to me, that's such a powerful story about unity and about America that, I've told that story a lot, but it's still, it gets me. It's
very powerful.
Yeah.
Colonel, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with much more of your story and talk about your book. We're talking with retired U.S. Army Colonel Daniel Gade. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade. Spent 25 years in service to our country, a veteran of the Iraq War. He is also the author of the brand new book, Wounding Warriors, How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. We'll be talking a lot about that over the course of our conversation, but we obviously want to continue where we left off, and that's where you were severely injured in Iraq. As I mentioned at the outset, it cost you your right leg. Given the extent of your injuries, were you aware of the severity right away?
No, not at all. So my last memory from Iraq is as the helicopter takes off. And I remember thinking, oh, thank God I'm saved. Because I remember the feeling of the helicopter has a specific feeling, and I remember feeling that feeling, and I was like, oh, good, I'm okay. And then I woke up 3 weeks later at Walter Reed. So I passed out on the helicopter, and then I had surgery right away. I was in surgery actually like 35 minutes after I got blown up, which is amazing because I would have been dead in 40. I mean,
when you needed the blood.
Right? That's when I needed the blood. It was really, really close. And so they did a bunch of surgery on me there, and then they flew me to Baghdad. It's this whole saga where the helicopter's getting shot at, and the equipment is failing, and all this stuff. I was unconscious for it, but the stories are harrowing. So they landed me in Baghdad, turned me over to the Army for more surgical stuff. If you've seen the movie Baghdad ER on HBO, that's where I was. I was actually at that surgical hospital. And then they flew me through a different place off to Germany, and then immediately to the States, because by then my body was shutting down badly. I had kidney failure and liver failure and open abdominal wounds. My whole abdomen was open. My leg was still attached, but was in bad shape. I had tons of infections beginning and things like that. So I got blown up on Monday afternoon Iraq time. I got to America Thursday night, U.S. time, and my wife was actually there when I got to the hospital, and my big brother had flown in, and he was there when I got to the hospital as well. But I was unconscious for weeks. And in the ICU, I woke up at the end of January or early February kind of time frame in the ICU, and and then passed out again, and then woke up again, and then passed out again. Like it was bad. But by then, my leg was gone. About a week after I came in, they had amputated the leg at the hip because the way the wounds were, the leg was poisoning me. It was killing me, and so they were like, "It's got to come off," and so they took it off. And so I spent about 2.5 or 3 months in the surgical intensive care unit, which is like the highest level of intensive care, and then another month in the regular intensive care unit, and then about a month and a half in the step down unit, which is like basically Ward 57 was at the time was kind of famous as like the amputee ward. I was in 57, and then I was discharged from the hospital to become an outpatient at like end of May-ish time frame. So I spent about 130 or so days in the hospital total. About 40 surgeries during that time, lots and lots of blood, lots and lots of suffering.
When you did realize what had happened to you, you obviously know your life's never going to be the same.
Sure.
How do you process that?
Well, for me, what was really strange is when somebody's in the ICU, you sort of are hoping that they are that they're just out of it, that their brain's turned off too, so that they're not suffering, right? But for me, I was suffering. I was having these horrible nightmares, and the nightmares were that my penis had gotten blown off, that both of my legs were gone, that my wife was having an affair. I mean, all this just crazy stuff that was just not true. And later I found out like a year ago that there's actually a term for that. It's called intensive care psychosis. It's real. But I had this crazy situation when I was unconscious. And when I became conscious and they said, "Hey, your leg is gone," my next question was like, "Okay, well, how high is the other one?" And they're like, "No, your other one's fine." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Oh, phew, what a relief." So it was almost like a relief relative to what I thought was wrong.
Exactly 1 year to the day
Yeah.
after the injury, you begin grad school.
That's right.
What did you need to do to convince yourself or to just get yourself on that course to say, I'm not staying here, I'm moving forward?
Yeah, so before I'd gotten blown up, I had orders to teach at West Point. So I'd been accepted to be a professor there, and so they had this pipeline of higher education and all this stuff. So I decided in about April that I wanted to stay in the Army. If they would let me, I would stay in the Army. And the Army was like, yeah, cool. You could still provide value for the service. All of that. So I wanted to stay in the Army, and so it was a process of recovery. I had to learn how to walk again. At the time, I don't use a prosthetic anymore, but I was at the time. So I had to learn how to use a prosthetic. I had to learn how to do all that stuff. I had to recover enough physically that I had enough strength to just do regular stuff. And that was a long process. And actually, in the book Wounding Warriors has its roots in that time frame. Because while I was striving to see how good I could be and how much I could recover, I was observing my fellow wounded warriors and later a bunch of other people, but I was observing others around me framing their lives around, like, how much can I get from other people? And I remember being sort of flabbergasted and disgusted by that because why would you want to go from being this high-performing, successful, brave person to being, a welfare queen, right? But I saw them doing it. I saw the transition, but I didn't have enough education and training at that point to understand it. So when I started my master's in public administration and policy, I focused a lot of my individual research in the veteran space and saw some of that academically. And then in 2007, as I'm finishing up my master's degree, I get a call from the White House, cold call from the White House, and they said, hey, this was when there's a big, the Bush administration had a scandal, the Walter Reed scandal. Famous, everybody knows about it, who was in D.C. at the time. It was a big deal, Pulitzer Prize winning event for the reporters.
Terrible conditions at Walter Reed.
Supposedly. Now, they're selective reporting in a major way, because I had great care at Walter Reed, and so many other people did too. But I got invited to work at the White House doing policy at the White House for veterans and military health care policy. And so then I went from having an academic experience and a personal experience, an academic experience, and then had practical experience in government at the very highest level. I mean, my office was in the White House, right? Or in the building across the street. So then after that year of observing the veteran service organizations and the VA and all that as a senior executive, then I went back to get my PhD. And that's when I really dove into this whole problem of veterans care and how we can make it better, how we can help veterans thrive instead of having veterans do what we see now, which is veterans, as Wounding Warriors talks about in the title, becoming sicker and poorer due to bad policy. So I experienced the bad policy, I trained on the bad policy, I helped administer the bad policy, and then I went back and trained on it some more, and then I said, okay, we've got to change this. And that's the roots of Wounding Warriors.
And we're going to get into that in just a moment. I should point out, not only did you set your mindset to getting your advanced degrees, you became a triathlete, which is quite amazing under those circumstances. But we'll talk a lot more about the disability situation, the depth of the problem, and your proposed solutions in just a moment. This is Veterans Chronicles. We're talking with retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade. The book is Wounding Warriors, How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. We'll dive into that in just a moment here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade, 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army, veteran of the Iraq War, where he was severely wounded. We just heard the harrowing story of how close he came to dying and just the remarkable mindset that he had as he recovered. But he also just explained in our previous segment about the problems with the disability system that he saw through the VA and even in the hospital. And that has led him on an academic and policy journey that has now led to the book Wounding Warriors, How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. And Colonel, one of the things that stands out in the early part of this book is how when service members are about to be discharged, they get brought into a room and basically told, hey, sign up for as many disabilities as possible. Why is that the policy, and how does that end up impacting how they, I guess, see themselves?
Yeah, so, the VA is required by law to, there's basically an open door policy, a no wrong door policy. And the idea is that every veteran should be told what they're entitled to. So the VA's, in transition assistance, in the transition assistance program, you'll have a, stereotypical, right, but little lady in tennis shoes comes out and says, hey, everybody, we all sign up for benefits, and here's how you do it, and here's where you list, here's your forms, and here's where you list all your stuff. And that's like 3 days of transition assistance program. And then there's like half a day where they're like, oh yeah, you might want to get a job, here's some websites. And then there's half a day of like, some, make sure you get your life insurance squared away or some nonsense like that. So the whole process is focused on helping people get their benefits. Here's the problem. The entire benefits infrastructure has evolved over the last 100 years in a way that nobody ever intended. And it goes back to, it's a political problem ultimately. And Wounding Warriors it's a deeply political book, but it's not a partisan book because both parties have a serious flaw here. And here's the flaw. The left believes that every veteran is a broken toy who is a victim of a patriarchal system. They're economic draftees. They have to join because they don't have any other options. And John Kerry famously said it himself when he said if you're stupid, you go to Iraq. If you're smart, you go to college. Remember that from like 05-ish is when he said it, 06. So that's literally, that's the left's view of the military, which is that they're all broken toys. But because they're broken toys, they deserve everything. So hold that thought, right? And on the right believes that anybody who ever looks at a uniform, whether they're a generator mechanic in the Coast Guard or a Navy SEAL with a Medal of Honor or a soldier in the Army who kills people who don't need to get killed, which happens occasionally, by the way, sometimes caught, sometimes not. If you even look at a uniform, you're a hero, and so you deserve everything. And so the political sides come together on deserve everything, and nobody's ever thinking critically about what deserve everything means, except for the veteran service organizations, the VFW, AMVETS, DAV, all of those are designed in part to be rent-seeking organizations that come to the politicians and they say, hey, politicians, do you agree that veterans deserve everything? And the politicians are like, oh, yeah, veterans deserve everything. And the DAV and all those people are like, cool, benefits is what we want. And so cash benefits it becomes the way that we can express our gratitude towards veterans. Here's the problem. The problem is that what those cash benefits do is change the identity of the recipient of the cash benefits in a way that causes them to see themselves and to be seen by society as less valuable. And so we have at the same time as we have a suicide crisis among veterans, which suicide is a disease of despair, we have a system that pays people to feel worthless, that has the effect of making people feel worthless. And I saw it in my own life. I saw it by policy. We studied it in Wounding Warriors, and nobody wants to talk about it until they're out of office. After they're out of office, everybody's like, oh, yeah, you're totally right. And the people who reviewed my books, Secretary Mattis, Secretary of the VA Nicholson, Secretary Principi, others, Medal of Honor recipients the Medal of Honor recipient who reviewed the book is named Jack Jacobs. He's politically on the left. He's on MSNBC all the time. He's like, yeah, this is totally right. Your argument is 100% right. But when these people are in positions of power, they don't want to deal with it because it's the third rail. And so the purpose of Wounding Warriors, in part, is to shine a light on this because we should do better for our veterans, right? I'm not anti-veteran. I love veterans, right? I obviously, 25 years in the Army, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 leg. I love veterans. But we need to love them the right way. We need to help them reskill, transition, and upskill in ways that set them up to be productive members of society and not to be broken toys. The example I always use is, when somebody's in society, they're a productive plow, right? They're high school students. They're going to high school. They're working at a grocery store like I did. Whatever they're doing, right? They're a productive plow. And then we bring them in the military either through a draft in the old days or through or through voluntary enlistment or whatever, and we put them through basic training and Ranger School and Airborne School and all this SEAL buds, whatever, and we beat them into a sword. And then we use that sword for our nation's purposes, at war or at peace or whatever. We use that sword for our nation's purposes, and some of the swords get broken. Some of them get rusty. Some of them get dented. When we're done using them as a society, when they retire or are otherwise discharged, what do we owe them? I think what we owe them is a reforging process to make them back into productive plows. And right now what we have is a process that throws the swords in the corner and then acts stunned when the swords get rusty.
What was the original definition of a disability benefit, and how has that changed over time? So back when it was created, what was the intent of the disability program, and how does that compare to where we're at right now?
Yeah, right after the Civil War, Union-only veterans got, the Confederate veterans weren't considered to be veterans for a very long time, for 30 or 40 years, until there was some forgiveness involved after the Civil War, because of course they had rebelled, right? But loss of an eye, loss of a hand, loss of a foot were like the disabilities. And over time, just like a coral reef grows like one thing at a time, over time, the system has expanded from real war wounds, which everybody agrees, like, yes, real war wounds, Dan Crenshaw's eye, my leg, whoever, spinal cord, those are real things that maybe we have a societal obligation to do some compensation for. That's fine. I don't think anybody cares about that. Or nobody is kicking against that. But over time, other things have been added. And there's some real abuses in the system. Let me give you some examples. Here's an abuse. The fastest growing condition, one of the fastest growing conditions in the United States is sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is caused by two things only. Number one, having a narrow neck circumference naturally. You just happen to have a skinny neck, right? And number two, being obese. That's it. But if you are prescribed a positive pressure breathing machine from the VA, that's a 50% disability. A below-knee amputation is only a 40% disability, but a CPAP is a 50% disability. Now, sleep apnea is a serious condition. It needs treatment. But there's no such thing in the VA as a treatment-only condition. There's disabilities that then you can get treatment for. But there's no treatment-only conditions, and sleep apnea is a classic treatment-only condition. And the VA also pays for things that are clearly related to lifestyle and not related to military service in any way. Example, type 2 diabetes. So Vietnam veterans who served on the ground or offshore of Vietnam are considered to be exposed to Agent Orange, which of course is a terrible chemical. And those people are also getting type 2 diabetes at very high rates because now they're in their 70s and they're obese. And so what's happening is people are getting type 2 diabetes. And if you have type 2 diabetes or any one of these other lifestyle conditions, you have two choices. Number one is to say, well, maybe I should exercise, eat right, put away the ice cream, get my body mass index down, and then my type 2 diabetes will naturally come under control. But that would require me to say to myself, I'm the cause, and therefore I need to take responsibility and solve it. Or you can do the other thing, which is what the system enables. And the system says, if you have type 2 diabetes and you're a Vietnam veteran, it's the government's fault. And you can get paid for it, and you can shirk your personal responsibility for having gotten that condition. And so you can get paid a lot of money for it. If you take daily insulin for your type 2 diabetes, actually I don't remember if it's the one where you take insulin or you have to do something else. Anyway, if you're daily medicating your type 2 diabetes, you are considered to be 100% disabled. And that's a lifestyle condition. So the VA has become basically a place where war-wounded people are buried under an avalanche of lifestyle conditions and conditions of aging. Like, we all live in a broken, fallen world, right? My neck sometimes gets stiff, but it's because I'm 46, not because I was in the Army for 25 years. It's just every 46-year-old's neck feels sore sometimes. And 86-year-olds feel sore a lot of the time, right? Because we live in a broken world that has gravity, So there's some abuses are built into the system. And people know this, but it's a comfortable, warm blanket to cover yourself up with and say, oh, it's somebody else's fault. It's the government's fault. It's my fellow citizens' fault. And if you're willing to tell that little white lie, then you can get paid for it. And so there's an avalanche of disability claims.
There are, of course, conditions, you spend a lot of time in the book talking about PTSD, that are not obvious. And they're hard to test for, although they do try to test for them.
Yeah.
And so while you're trying to make sure that you're weeding out frivolous claims and so forth, you definitely want to make sure you're not depriving benefits of somebody who's clearly needing them. So what do you do?
Yeah, it's a wheat and a chaff problem. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you separate people who are truly ill and suffering from people who are potentially grifting or faking it, you know? And with PTSD, it's a very easy condition to fake. And in Wounding Warriors, we talk about this extensively. There's a clinical psychologist in Puerto Rico, a woman, who will, for $200, if you're a veteran, probably if you're not a veteran too, but for $200 cash, she'll do a brief phone interview with you and then give you a filled out disability benefits questionnaire, which is a VA form, that you can then turn into the VA to get your 100% disability. True fact. So she doesn't care about your health. She just cares about her little paycheck, and then you can take that and you can get big money. So PTSD is really strange because it's not a condition. It's a label for a basket of conditions. So depression, anxiety, sometimes flashbacks potentially, sleeplessness, anger management, all of that is a basket situation where all those things are put in the PTSD basket. And in the VA system, once you can prove that you have PTSD, you get 30, 70, or 100% disability for PTSD. And there are coaching guides online that you can download that tell you exactly how to get the compensation. So if you go into your compensation and pension examination and you're sitting there and you poop your pants, like right in the meeting, you're just like, oh, you poop. Well, guess what? That's powerful demonstration that you are unable to control yourself, and so therefore that's one of the check blocks. And so the psychologist's like, check, 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 and then you get your 100%. But get this, you're not ever required to get treatment. You're only given the compensation for it. And so one of the things that we propose in the epilogue, or in the afterword or epilogue of Wounding Warriors, available for pre-order on woundingwarriors.com. I'll send you a signed copy. One of the things we talk about in the epilogue of Wounding Warriors is like, what's the policy way forward here? And one of the things we need to do, and we need to do this like yesterday, and people have been writing about it for years, but it never happens. There's no treatment compensation link. So in other words, with PTSD in particular, or other conditions that can get better with treatment, you should have to go to your monthly counseling appointment or your weekly counseling appointment and have those checked off in the system. And then if you get the check marks, then you get your compensation at the end of the month. Because that does a couple things. Number one, people who are fakers are going to be like, it's too much work. I don't really want to do that. I'm going to opt out, right? People who are truly ill and get the treatment can get better. PTSD is entirely treatable, even curable in civilian populations. Well known. I mean, even rape victims, horrible, violent crime victims, can and do get better commonly. And so it's a treatable condition. So those people can get better. And then the third way that would be great is there are veterans out there suffering from real mental health crisis right now. Some of them are going to kill themselves today. If we had a system of linking compensation and treatment, we would also know who's getting compensated but not treated. And then we can call them. Then we can go to their house. Then we can find them and say, hey, man, hey, come on in. We love you. We want you to get the treatment that will help you get better. So there's three ways that would help. And yet the veteran service organizations and all that are utterly opposed to that idea.
Why? Why is therapy not at least equal, if not more of a priority, so you can move people potentially past some of these problems?
I mean, there's a cynical answer, and then there's a longer answer. I tend to go, and I'm not a cynic, but I've seen this up close for a decade and a half now. Because their constituencies, in many cases, are getting compensated for diseases that are not true, that are it's not the case. So in Wounding Warriors, we give plenty of examples of this, of people who faked even spinal cord injuries. And then once they got their compensation, all of a sudden they're healed and they can just walk around, but the VA never comes back to get the compensation back. And with PTSD, you only need to fake it once and you can get compensated for the rest of your life. And so there are a lot of members of disabled American veterans and VFW and just regular veterans out there who are getting compensated for something that is simply not true, or that was true at one point that is no longer true, or something that is true but is attributable to a different cause, some other cause, genetics or whatever. So we have a guy in the book that we talk about who, in Wounding Warriors that we talk about, who had a schizophrenic break in high school. His parents were both schizophrenics. He had a schizophrenic break in high school. He goes in the Marine Corps. He goes to Anbar Province, has serious mental health conditions in his combat experience, gets out of the Marine Corps, and then blames his schizophrenia on his time in the service. Well, schizophrenia symptoms are different from PTSD symptoms, by the way. They're totally unrelated. But it's easier for him to blame his schizophrenia on his time in combat and to ignore the fact that he himself had a previous history of schizophrenia. And so, what do you do about that? Well, we desperately need reform to the system. So there's a couple of things we talk about in the epilogue. One is a treatment compensation link. Number two is incentivize behaviors that we want and not behaviors that we don't want. So, for example, if a veteran goes in for an annual physical, say, and he has a body mass index that is within normal range, give him some money. Give him $1,500, right? Here you go. Here's why? Because we know that obesity has a specific cost associated with it. We know heart disease and diabetes and all these things are related to obesity. So why don't we pay people to maintain their BMI in a healthy range rather than the opposite of paying them to be disabled? So that's another thing that we can do. But ultimately, what we ought to do with our veterans care, and I think a lot about the word deserving or the word earned or the word entitled. And I think what veterans earn, deserve, and are entitled to is to be reforged from being that sword back into being a productive plow. Even if we have to put a lot of resources into that, fine, let's do it. Let's take resources out of things that are unproductive and counterproductive and put them into things that are productive. And there's unproductivity and counterproductivity in the disability system baked into the cake. The bulk of what the VA is compensating for by paying disability is conditions of aging. I mean, all you have to do is go to any VA hospital. Are you going to see a bunch of war-wounded guys in wheelchairs and walkers and blind people with canes? No, absolutely not. You're going to see a bunch of old men going there for geriatric care. Look, that's important. I'm all on board with taking care of our veterans healthcare-wise. But what we shouldn't do is pretend that routine conditions of aging are the responsibility of the American taxpayer in terms of the disability system. Because what we do is, ultimately, we're paying veterans to be sick. And a young man who's paid to be sick and sit at home at age 24, he's playing video games and drinking whiskey at 10 a.m. For a weekend, that's fun. And for a week, that's fine. Go for it. For a lifestyle, it's debilitating. And they look across the gulf of 60 years between now and when they're going to die of old age, and they say, maybe I should just speed up the process. And so part of our veteran suicide crisis is driven by the uselessness that the government puts into people's lives by paying them to be sick and disabled.
Colonel Gade, we need to take a break here in just a moment, but I want to clarify what some folks may be thinking here, because, of course, there are some dubious claims. Mm-hmm. There are examples of fraud, certainly. But the villain here in your story is the system, correct?
The system is the villain, yes. Individual veterans responding to incentives to claim disability or whatever are not the villain. As a matter of fact, they're the victim of a bad system. What we need to do is reform the system to create fewer victims. Yeah.
We're speaking with retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade. The book is Wounding Warriors: How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. Much more on this subject when we come back, right here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Daniel Gade. Spent 25 years in service to our country. His book is Wounding Warriors: How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. And kind of where we left off in the last segment, Colonel, brings us to the issue of employment. How does being disabled, how do employers really look at that? I think mostly society thinks returning veterans, great, give them a job. A disabled veteran who's able to do the job, even better. But how does either the mindset or just having that designation impact employment opportunities?
Well, so a couple of ways. So I'll unpack that like little by little. So the payments associated with disability, we know scientifically reduce work effort. Here's how. Every national park has signs like "Don't feed the bears." Why? Because you don't want the bears to become dependent on free stuff from people. Because then they start digging in the trash and looting cars and doing all the stuff that bears do, right? You want bears out doing bear stuff, flipping over rocks and eating grubs and all the stuff that they're supposed to do. So same thing is true of people. If you give somebody cash payments, what we know is that will reduce their work effort. It will reduce their motivation to work. And that's true of veterans too, and it's true of disabilities. It's true of veterans disability payments. It's true of Social Security disability payments. It's true of a check that you get every month from your grandma if you get one, right? We know that reduces work effort. So that's part one. It means veterans will supply less labor to the labor market. Part two of this whole problem is that years ago, when people were coming back from even Vietnam or especially World War II, Korea, they were seen as like heroes. They were coming back, and employers wanted to employ them, and they came back and they got on with their lives, and they didn't talk about Vietnam anymore, but they got on with their lives. And that's a very productive way for society to look at these folks. Unfortunately, over the last especially 20 years, the public face of many employers, I mean, name it, Boeing, Lockheed, CACI, everybody wants to employ veterans on paper. They say they want to employ Amazon. They say they want to employ veterans. And they do. They try to hire veterans. But when you survey, and Pew Research does this, they survey employers, and they create one of those word cloud things for veterans. And it used to be that the term veteran was associated with heroism and sacrifice and service. Now it's associated with mental illness, instability, unreliability. Those are the terms that people are using quietly behind closed doors. That's what they're saying to each other, like veterans aren't reliable anymore. And we as veterans have done this to ourselves. We've done this to ourselves by embracing the disability mindset, by walking around, and I love dogs, I love my mother, I love apple pie, I love the American flag. But walking around with service dogs when you're not disabled and don't need a service dog is sending a signal to everybody around you that you're broken, that you have something wrong with you emotionally. And so now when people see a veteran symbols or veteran whatever, they say, okay, that person is broken. That person is mentally ill, unstable, whatever. And so although public facing, they're like, yes, veterans are who we want. Privately, they're like, gosh, another veteran. I'm not sure about that. And that's on us, man. That's our own fault as veterans. We did that to ourselves. And it's on us to dig ourselves out, which is possible, right? And the way it's possible is by getting a widespread movement of people who are rejecting this fake disability narrative and embracing the ability narrative, really getting after, like, how can I make sure that that I am providing for my family, providing value to the society, taking care of myself, and serving others in a way that's inspirational, in a way that is in accordance with my values.
One of the things that needs attention, it would seem, is where we started this conversation and what soon-to-be discharged service members are hearing. You mentioned the 3 days of benefits, and here's a link to get a job, maybe. So how would you change that process so they don't even start thinking down that path?
Yeah, I mean, first, anytime somebody has a real condition, we should have a treatment-first mentality, right? Because a disability is the residual of failed treatment, right? So if somebody's hurt, scuffed up, mentally ill, whatever, we should put them through a whole set of treatment And then whatever's left over after the treatment fixes most of what was wrong, that's the amount of disability. Right now, the way the system does is whatever the condition is, it assigns it a disability and then never downgrades that disability. So we ought to start with treatment first. So that's very important. And then disability discussion shouldn't even come in until much, much later. And then as veterans, I always talk about there's something called it's basically a mental experiment or a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Every veteran, I think, should imagine walking up to 10 random citizens and saying, hey, listen, I'm a disabled veteran. And they'll say, thank you for your service. And you say, and my conditions are. And you list them 1 to N, whatever N is, 1 to 50. And if that's embarrassing to you as a veteran to have to list those, then maybe they're not legit, right? Maybe you shouldn't claim them if they're not real. And if the person who was let's say a truck driver or a factory worker or whatever, if they say, well, I was never in the military, I've got sore knees too, well, then maybe that's a common condition of humanity and not a veteran-related disability, you know? So for me, when I went out, and people are sometimes like, well, but, did you file for disability? I did. But when I came out of the military, what I did was I sat down with a VA person, and they said, hey, you're going to list ringing in the ears and PTSD and brain injury and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, I don't have any of those things. I'm not listing that. And they said, well, but we can get you paid. And I'm like, stop. This is a moral question. The only things I'll put down on that sheet are combat-caused conditions. So the amputation, yes, I'm okay with my fellow citizens paying me for my missing leg at the hip for the rest of my life. No problem. But I'm not okay with claiming a bunch of stuff that's not true or that's exaggerated or that is a result of my lifestyle or my age and not the result of my combat exposure.
You mentioned earlier on in our conversation that people agree with you who are no longer in position to do anything about it. So how do you get the people who do have the power to do something about it?
Well, I think what this ultimately takes is for the people who are seeing this and the people who are forwarding it to their friends and saying, holy cow, this guy's saying what's true and thank God. I think it's going to take a groundswell of veterans saying what's true and stopping saying what's not true. Now, that's optimistic, but I like to be an optimistic guy. I hope that we can change the narrative around veterans because ultimately we owe veterans a successful transition if possible. What we don't owe veterans is cash payments for conditions of aging. It's just nonsense. So, but this was caused by veterans. It was created by veterans. It's veteran service organizations that sparked all this off. It's got to be those same groups of people who say, wait a second, what we're doing is immoral. What we're doing is wrong. We got to fix it. And so I have quiet backdoor conversations with members of Congress and with VA officials and with defense officials and things like that all the time. And they're all saying, yeah, you're right. But what I'm trying to do with Wounding Warriors, available for pre-order on woundingwarriors.com, what I'm trying to do with Wounding Warriors is change the conversation and critically look at what is really causing veteran dysfunction in the United States and making it better for the next generation of veterans. Because if my sons or daughter decide to go in the military, great. I want them to come out of that with positive experiences that empower them for life and not be labeled as broken toys just because they decided to serve their country for a few years.
You talked about the positive reaction you've received. We've talked in the breaks here about how this can be a very upsetting message potentially to people. What have you heard in terms of folks who might be alarmed by the fact that it looks like veterans are not being shown in the greatest of light here?
Well, again, it's the system that's not being shown in a positive light. Individual veterans are rarely the problem. There's sometimes like explicit fakers, but those are relatively rare, we think. It's the system that's causing the problem, not individual veterans. But there are some people in positions of power who are literally like hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. They just don't want to hear this argument at all because it threatens existing power structures. And I'm happy to do that. Look, I've got plenty of titles, plenty of accomplishments. I'm okay with grabbing the third rail and saying, hang on a second here, folks, we're doing the wrong thing. We need to fix this. And hopefully I can, really spark a change around how veterans are perceived.
You've mentioned it a couple of times now. Give the website for the book.
woundingwarriors.com. And it's also available on Amazon. It's available on Audible. And the Audible book, I actually narrated myself because I think that's really important that authors do that if they have a pleasingly acceptable voice, and I hope I do. But it's available on all those platforms and wherever books are sold. I've always wanted to say that.
Fantastic. woundingwarriors.com. Colonel Gade, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much, Greg.
Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade, 25 years in service to our country, veteran of the Iraq War. He has been honored with the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and again, the title of the book, Wounding Warriors, How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corumbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.